The year was a very tough year, let's be honest, and a very painful year.
Share prices are down across the entire sector.
We know what it's going to take.
Oil companies come out of 2020 with scars and pressure to accelerate the energy transition.
We have to have renewables. We have to have electric vehicles, but you cannot do it without carbon capture. Every climate model by credible institutions insists that carbon capture has to be a huge part of this.
The IEA tells us how carbon capture is cleaning up the energy industry.
It's not just about coal-fired power generation. It's not just about fossil fuels even. You can apply CCUS to bioenergy, for example, and support carbon removal.
And the man who took carbon out of cars wants to pull it out of the air. Elon Musk offers a $100 million prize for the best carbon-negative technology.
Just him mentioning the space alone is going to bring a lot of attention. It's going to bring attention from innovators. It's going to bring attention from people that maybe don't normally follow the climate world. And I think it's also going to bring attention from investors.
I'm Annmarie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green. The richest man in the world is doubling down on his green credentials. In January, Elon Musk announced a $100 million prize for the best carbon capture technology. And this week, we have the details. Entries will open on Earth Day, that's April 22nd, and the top 3 will be awarded the prizes of $50 million, $20 million, and $10 million on the same day in 2025. But before we take a deeper look at the competition, what exactly is carbon capture? Here's a closer look at sustainable solutions.
It may suck, but that's exactly what humanity needs to start doing. That is, humans need to start sucking enormous amounts of carbon dioxide out of the air to avoid catastrophic global warming. Even if we reach zero emissions by adopting wind, solar, and nuclear power, what about the carbon that's already in the atmosphere? Negative emissions technologies also need to be deployed. So what are the options? The oldest method and most easy to understand is to plant and preserve more trees. Such climate solutions could produce 37% of the cuts needed to meet Paris Climate Accord goals by 2030. But trees need land and soil, and it's unclear that there's enough to support a massive planting effort. The land area required for these results could be as large as 3 times the size of India. Another solution is carbon capture and storage, or CCS. Here's how it works. Carbon is captured from the exhaust stream of power generators or heavy industrial plants. Then it's compressed and dispatched to special geological sites, where it's injected deep underground or pumped into oil wells to boost production. Some 19 industrial plants around the world store approximately 40 million metric tons of carbon dioxide underground each year. But a well-known failure for the industry was a $7.5 billion clean coal plant in Mississippi, which eventually became a natural gas facility, no longer capturing carbon. The burning of biomass or organic matter like trees for fuel can be coupled with CCS and is considered carbon negative. The plants pull carbon as they grow, and if you can capture and store that carbon when burned, then boom, carbon negative. But we also need to plant trees to capture carbon. And do we have enough land to grow enough biomass? On the horizon is the technology of carbon dioxide removal, or CDR. Carbon is captured from the air chemically by machines, many times faster than trees can. The facility is built alongside industrial plants, which takes in the CO2 as raw material and uses it to produce things like fuel, plastic, or concrete. The advantage of CDR is that its facility can be built where the carbon dioxide is being reused, not just where it's being produced. But as of now, the costs of the technology are way more than CCS applied to coal or biomass facilities. Swiss startup Climeworks estimates its cost between $600 to $800 per metric ton of CO2 captured. Carbon Engineering, a Canadian startup, puts it at closer to $250 per metric ton. Ultimately, the answers to our carbon problem will lie in a mix of all technologies. Agriculture could play a big role, as soil and certain crops are natural carbon sinks. Biochar, the byproduct of burning biomass in the absence of oxygen, is a form of carbon sequestration that can be added to soil while also improving its water and nitrogen retention. There's even a process called enhanced weathering, where certain minerals are exposed to air, sparking a chemical reaction that transforms CO2 into carbonate rock materials. The byproducts of enhanced weathering could be spread on agricultural lands to improve soil alkalinity and crop yield.
Musk's carbon capture contest will be run by the XPRIZE Foundation. They're a nonprofit that holds competitions to advance technology in space travel, food, and health. I caught up with Marcus Extavar, the executive director of prize operations at XPRIZE. I asked him about his hopes for the competition.
We're thrilled to be announcing XPRIZE carbon removal with the help of the Musk Foundation. It's actually a concept we've been working on for a little bit of time. It was first proposed at one of our ideation sessions that we run at XPRIZE every year called Visioneering. And since then, we've done a lot of research, spoken to a lot of experts in the field, and tried to craft a prize design. When we linked up with the Musk Foundation, they brought a lot of their ideas, helped us refine the design. I think Elon Musk is known for prioritizing climate. He's got several businesses focusing on reducing climate change. So I think in that sense, it was sort of a coming together.
Do you think Elon Musk brings something to this industry to get it excited about when you're talking about carbon neutrality?
He absolutely does. I think that people like him that are known for visionaries and being visionaries in business and innovation in particular, just him mentioning the space alone is going to bring a lot of attention. It's going to bring attention from innovators. It's going to bring attention from people that maybe don't normally follow the climate world. And I think it's also going to bring attention from investors. I think that's the kind of attention that we need. Great thing about a prize is that you can put the challenge out to everyone and bring as many different solutions to bear as possible. And then the marketplace can take them forward, figure out how to deploy them in what places, in what country, in what region. But I think there's no doubt that this is going to bring a lot of attention to the space. And that's frankly the whole point of the exercise. How do we shine a spotlight on this space, focus on the innovators, and try to raise the level to help everybody?
There's the conventional carbon capture, especially when you think in the fossil fuel industry. And then there's the real carbon neutrality and lots of other technologies that can go towards this. Have you seen any technology so far that you think is very promising?
Yes, absolutely. There's several. And this is not a new field. There's been a lot of academic study, and actually there are a handful of solutions already out there trying to scale. What we're trying to accomplish with the prize is push as many of those concepts into demonstration as possible and create as many different viable solutions that can actually scale. The focus here is taking CO2 out of the air or the oceans. There's no shortage of ideas on how to do this. The question is which ones can work, which ones can be demonstrated, and which ones can get cheap enough and effective enough to scale massively.
What's the outlook for the carbon removal industry 5-10 years on?
A couple ways to answer that. From a climate perspective, if we're just thinking about climate change and how to avoid the worst effects, we need large carbon removal capacity in the next couple of decades. And to be honest, we're not close to where we need to be. So we need a dramatic acceleration and a doubling down on the solutions that we know are ready to work, but also prizes like XPRIZE carbon removal to dramatically open up the space and push a lot more solutions forward. Carbon removal is not one thing, it's sort of an outcome. And so what's really exciting about this prize, but just the field generally, is that it can take on many forms. And I think to get to, let's say, the 10 billion tons of removal every year that the IPCC has suggested that we need about 30 years from now, it's going to take many solutions in many parts of the world of many types, probably hundreds and thousands of different individual projects to get there. We have a couple of great ones today, but we really need to pick up the pace. And my hope that XPRIZE carbon removal can be a big part of that.
Coming up, is our addiction to fossil fuels a myth? We look into the numbers behind energy efficiency and why they might mean a faster and less painful transition to green energy. This is Bloomberg Green. From Bloomberg's European headquarters in London, I'm Annmarie Hordern. Now let's get your green brief with Jennifer Zabazaja.
Here's the climate news you need to know this week. fossil fuel pollution kills more people than we thought. According to a new study published by the Environmental Research Journal, it's responsible for more than 8 million premature deaths a year. That's double the previous high-end estimate and 3 times the total number killed by HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria in 2018. British Airways is looking to become more sustainable. It's partnering with U.S. startup LanzaJet for an ethanol-based fuel, part of the airline's plan to cut emissions and decarbonize by 2050. Jet makers are also getting in on the action. Airbus is looking to build a range of hydrogen-powered planes by 2035. And a region of eastern Germany is setting its sights on becoming a battery hub. Tesla is building its first European car plant there, but it's far from alone. Firms from Germany, France, and the US are looking to build chemical and battery sites too. It's fueling hopes that the state of Brandenburg can become a center for EVs. And that's your Green Brief. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in New York. Annmarie?
Carbon capture and storage technology sounds good, but it's still not a major factor in reducing CO2 in the atmosphere. CCS, though, is a key tool in getting emissions down globally, particularly when most of the world still relies on fossil fuels. Plus, it's not just energy production that emits. Everything from architecture to agriculture also plays a part. So we spoke to the International Energy Agency's head of carbon capture about where we are in the technology and why it's so crucial.
Today we have around 20 facilities at commercial scale capturing CO2 from power plants, from natural gas processing plants, from steel mills. It's in the order of around 40 million tonnes a year. So compare that to perhaps global emissions from the energy sector in the order of 34 billion tonnes. It is small scale, but also we need to recognise that the emissions at a global level are coming from a range of sectors, still at a relatively small scale today, but there is strong momentum building for the technology that we're seeing currently. New investment incentives, including in the United States, but also strengthened climate goals and particularly net zero targets have really refocused attention on this technology recently.
With the coronavirus-led impact on economies, though, are you still bullish on the fact that governments are going to be able to support this kind of infrastructure and investment financially?
The level of stimulus packages that we're seeing really actually presents an opportunity for investment in these technologies, and particularly in the enabling infrastructure. Despite the economic impact of COVID, we have seen governments really double down on their climate commitments.
How do you convince activists, especially, that carbon capture is needed in the green transition? Because many of them connect carbon capture technology with oil and gas companies.
So I think it's really important to recognize that CCUS is really a suite of technologies. It's not just about coal-fired power generation. It's not just about fossil fuels even. You can apply CCUS to bioenergy, for example, and support carbon removal. You can capture CO2 directly out of the air. And we know we need it in certain sectors. The cement sector today accounts for around 7% of global CO2 emissions. So this is 2.5 times all aviation transport emissions. Currently, CCUS is the only technology solution we have to really drive down emissions in this sector.
What other industries do you think CCS is really going to be the make or break for?
Other heavy industry sectors, for example, steel and chemicals, CCUS can actually be a relatively cost-competitive solution, but also one of the key solutions we have for the really deep emissions reductions. Another role that we see as being quite critical for CCUS is really around existing infrastructure. Today, globally, we have a very young, very large fleet of existing assets. So that can be coal-fired power plants, cement plants, gas-fired power plants, steel mills. This infrastructure alone could contribute to temperature increases in the order of 1.65 degrees if these facilities were allowed to continue operating. So we need solutions for the existing infrastructure. Much of it is fossil-based.
How important is carbon capture in order to get to net zero emissions?
We look at hundreds of technologies, including CCUS, and we come to the conclusion that meeting net zero without CCUS would be virtually impossible. Aspects of this technology have been used in industry for many decades, even carbon storage. There are facilities that have been, or projects that have been storing CO2 for decades now, including offshore Norway. So we know we can do this. We know storage can be safe and effective. And we have the technologies today to be able to start deploying CCUS. The challenge primarily has been creating incentives for the investment and creating the business models to support the investment.
Are some of the numbers about humanity's reliance on fossil fuels out of date? The transition to green energy may be smoother than we think, and Bloomberg's Akshat Rathi busts the myths around efficiency on the route to net zero.
You're not as addicted to fossil fuels as you think. There's a number that many throw around. They say 80% of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels. We're addicted to these sources of energy, they say, and we won't be able to wean ourselves off them easily. The number is correct, but the interpretation? Maybe not. Much of the energy from fossil fuels is simply lost as waste heat and noise. As Shakespeare would put it, just sound and fury signifying nothing. For example, electric cars travel 3 times further than gasoline-powered cars for the same amount of energy they consume. Crazy, right? Fossil fuel cars waste a lot of energy as heat. There are even drivers who can cook a good meal using the waste heat of an internal combustion engine. Much of that waste is inevitable. Burning fossil fuels can never be 100% efficient. But the world cares about doing things with energy, not the waste. Experts find that even though fossil fuels generate 80% of the world's primary energy, they produce only 60% of its useful energy. Why should we care about these dry matters of how energy wonks measure things? Because misunderstanding these numbers dramatically overplays how difficult it will be to meet global clean energy goals. Solar and wind do not need to replace the waste heat produced in a coal or gas power plant. So clean energy sources have to produce only a fraction of the total energy that comes from fossil fuels to do the same amount of useful work. For example, coal burned today to generate electricity makes up 15% of the world's primary energy. But it only produces 5% of useful energy. Thus, solar and wind only need to replace the 5% and not the 15%. So next time you hear someone say that humanity is addicted to fossil fuels, which provide 80% of our energy, you'll know what to tell them. Overcoming this addiction is going to be easier than our outdated numbers make it seem. This is Net Zero. I'm Akshat Rathi. Follow us on Quick Take and Bloomberg.
Up next, why one of America's biggest oil and gas companies could make more money from CO2 than from crude. We speak to the CEO of Occidental about the big change for big oil. This is Bloomberg Green.
The year was a very tough year.
Share prices are down across the entire sector.
Let's be honest, and a very painful year.
Demand is down a little bit. Market conditions continue to still be challenged.
We've got vaccines, they're being rolled out. Things are looking better.
I would imagine in the second half of this year, we're beginning to see not only recovery, but we're beginning to see a little bit of tightness in the market disappearing.
We look to the future and we are committed to advancing a lower carbon future.
We know what it's going to take to achieve those carbon emissions.
We have some targets out there, around 50 gigawatts of renewable power.
Let's prepare ourselves to adopt new technologies.
The key is discipline.
But we also need to look out the window. And the reality is right now in the United States, there's 270 million registered vehicles. 269 million of them rely on internal combustion engines. So we need to deliver the fuels of today, tomorrow, for the next decade.
From Bloomberg's European headquarters in London, I'm Annmarie Hordern. Now, 2020 was a disastrous year for the global oil majors. Once the largest companies in the world, many are now trying to rebrand from big oil to big energy in a push to go green. And while not taking as drastic measures as some European companies, the former king of shale, Occidental, is trying for a new title, King of Carbon. My colleague Alex Steele explains.
It is the new holy grail for oil companies, that net zero emission target. One big part of that is direct air capture. Here's how it works. A machine pulls the air directly from the atmosphere. It's like a fan. An absorbent then attracts the CO2. You then remove it from the machine and inject it into rock, cement, or an oil well. Now the rest of the oxygen is then pumped back into the air. It can tackle current pollution plus old CO2 still lingering in the air. Now, there are only a few commercially operational facilities in the world today, like Switzerland and Iceland, run by startup Climeworks, and in British Columbia, run by Carbon Engineering. Now, they've just raised a few $1 million so far, but that number could get a lot bigger. Enter Occidental, one of the leading U.S. producers in the Permian Basin. Now, one of its subsidiaries teamed up with a private equity firm to form 1.5, which in turn is teaming up with Carbon Engineering. 1.5 provides the financing, Oxy provides the knowledge on carbon and injection, and Carbon Engineering provides the technology. Now, Oxy wants to build the world's largest direct air capture plant in the Permian, could be operational in 2023, and capture up to 1 million tons of CO2 a year. Here's the potential price tag. At the cost of reaching Oxy's 2040 net zero emission target using direct air capture could be somewhere between $2 and $5 billion a year. Now, that cost can be offset in other ways, like using that CO2 to get more oil out of rock or tax credits. But you get the idea, it could be really expensive. Now, for Oxy, it's worth it. The company wants to make as much money pulling carbon out of the air and storing it for themselves and for others as it does in its chemical business in just 10 to 15 years. Now, I recently sat down with CEO Vicki Hollub just to see how all of this would work.
The reality is we have to have everything working. We have to have renewables. We have to have electric vehicles. We have to have investment in trees and in natural sinks like that. But you cannot do it without carbon capture. Every climate model by credible institutions insists that carbon capture has to be a huge part of this. We are experts in carbon management. We've done CO2 processing for a long time. The footprint we have in the Permian gives us the ability to not only handle the CO2 on the surface through our 14 CO2 processing plants and 2,500 miles of pipelines, but to also process it through the reservoir in a very efficient way. Our direct air capture is the facility that we intend to build in the Permian is important because you can extract CO2 from the atmosphere anywhere, and it doesn't have to be at the industrial site. So it's not a technology that's a trial and error kind of thing. We know it will work. We need just to get it to scale.
So do you anticipate at some point making money off of it because you're able to use the CO2 to make your oil wells more efficient? Or do you make money off of it by then like renting this out to other companies that can't lower their emissions, like airplanes, for example? Like how does this fit into your business?
The benefit will be, and the way you make money on this is by increasing oil production. So you take the CO2, which ultimately will be at a lower cost than the CO2 that we get from organic sources today. So that CO2 lower cost, that's a way to increase our oil production at a lower cost. And also as we go into a lower carbon economy, everyone's going to need to lower their carbon footprint. So this gives people the incentive to come in and invest with us.
United Airlines, for example, made an investment in 1.5, and I wonder, like, what kind of sectors and interest are you getting?
We're getting interest not only from maritime companies, but from aviation companies, and also from technology companies, because data centers use a lot of energy.
If I talk to you in 15 years, are you still an oil company or are you a carbon capture technology company?
That gets back to what I was saying earlier. We are not afraid of the transition out of oil and gas, because we are a part of that transition. We're the company that can make it happen. And so I do believe that in 15 to 20 years, more of our cash and income will be from carbon management than from oil and gas.
So from big oil companies drawing carbon directly from the air to Elon Musk giving carbon capture a $100 million boost. That's all for this week, but keep the conversation going. Follow us on Twitter @Climate. I'm Annmarie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green.